No one expected it, certainly not in a quiet Montana town. A little blind girl and her service dog, both tasered by police in broad daylight. But when the emergency chopper landed minutes later, it wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Grace Taylor, barely 5, clutched her dog's paw as his chest rose faintly beneath her trembling fingers. Around them, silence turned to outrage, and a single question echoed through the crowd. How did this happen? Inside the trauma bay, a doctor's voice broke the tension. If we don't act now, the dog won't make it to morning. Tap like, tell us where you're watching from, and stay with us. Because what happens next will change everything. The wind in Cedar Glen carried the bite of early spring brisk, but softened by sunlight streaming over the tips of the northern Montana pines. A layer of snow still hugged the ground in shaded patches, but the roads had cleared enough for the drive. Emily Taylor adjusted the rearview mirror with one hand and reached toward the back seat with the other, her fingers brushing against a small mittened hand resting on the booster seat. Grace Taylor, 5 years old, sat quietly, facing forward with a stillness that often made strangers think she was asleep. But Emily knew better. Her daughter was listening, always listening. Grace was born blind, with pupils that held a soft, misty hue like early morning frost. Her skin was porcelain pale, framed by light brown curls that had never been trimmed short. She wore a knitted blue hat with tiny bear ears, a gift from her late father, and clutched a worn corduroy bunny in her lap. She rarely spoke. Ever since her father died in a rescue accident last winter, Grace had withdrawn further into herself, her world shrinking to whispers and silence. Emily, 34, was a tall woman with broad shoulders and tired eyes that once glowed behind green-rimmed glasses. Her auburn hair was pulled into a low bun, and the dark circles under her eyes betrayed the many nights spent juggling grief and work. She was a veterinarian, the only one in Cedar Glen Animal Clinic, and she had thrown herself into her job with a quiet desperation, as if saving animals could somehow ease the ache of not saving her husband. She loved her daughter fiercely, but connecting with Grace had become like trying to find a voice through a snowstorm. It was why they were on this road trip, why they had driven 2 hours to Bozeman's Service Animal Training Center. Today might change everything. The center itself was tucked at the edge of a wide valley, surrounded by low hills and wind-worn pine. It looked more like a farmhouse than a training facility, red siding, wide porch, and a cedar sign carved with paw prints. The air outside was thin and sharp, but Emily helped Grace down carefully, watching her daughter's small feet sink slightly into the gravel path. Inside, the building smelled of wood and straw and wet fur. Grace turned her head at the sound of barking high-pitched, sharp, excited. But she didn't flinch. Instead, her mittened hand held tighter to Emily's coat. A tall woman with silver hair pulled into a thick braid emerged from a side office. She walked with purpose, but her smile was warm. "You must be Emily and Grace. I'm Helen Dubois." "Welcome," she said, her voice carrying the calm of someone who had spent a lifetime with animals. Helen was in her 60s, wiry and upright, dressed in jeans and a forest green fleece. Her eyes were sharp but not unkind, eyes that had seen both triumph and heartbreak in equal measure. Years ago, her son had lost a leg in military service, and it was that personal journey that had led her to dedicate her retirement to training service dogs. Her center was small, selective, but renowned for matching the most withdrawn children with the most patient dogs. "Would Grace like to meet some of our trainees?" Helen asked. Emily glanced down at her daughter, who nodded slightly. They followed Helen into a large indoor training room. Grace held Emily's hand, stepping cautiously across the smooth concrete floor. There were 3 dogs in the enclosure that day, a sleek yellow Labrador rolling a ball with its nose, a chocolate poodle sitting calmly beside a trainer, and then there was Ranger. He sat apart from the others near the back wall, watching. His coat was a dark mix of black and tan, with a deep saddle marking and golden fur framing his face like a lion's mane. His ears were sharp, alert, and one had a small scar notched through the edge. He was larger than most German shepherds, and carried himself with the deliberate grace of someone used to working in chaos. Ranger was 5 years old, recently retired from the Montana Alpine Rescue Unit after a rock slide injured his hind leg. He had healed, but protocol required retirement after any major rescue incident. Helen gestured subtly. "That's Ranger. He hasn't been placed yet. Some dogs, like some people, take a little longer to find where they belong. Emily bent down beside Grace and said softly, "There's a dog named Ranger. He's watching us. Would you like to say hello?" Grace didn't speak, but slowly she let go of her mother's hand. She walked forward alone, guided only by the sound of breath and instinct. The room was quiet. The other dogs watched, but only Ranger stood. He took one step, then another. Grace stopped a few feet away. Her small hand reached out into the space between them. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't rush. He simply stepped forward and pressed his broad head into her open palm. Emily gasped, but didn't move. Grace's fingers curled gently into Ranger's fur. She turned slightly, not to face her mother, but the room, and said one clear word for the first time in weeks. "Warm." Helen blinked, her voice caught in her throat. Emily pressed her hand over her mouth. It wasn't just the word, it was the tone, the emotion in it. It wasn't a word for the dog's body temperature. It was a word for the moment, the connection, the thawing that had just begun. Ranger sat beside Grace, not moving except to tilt his head under her hand, like a practiced gesture of devotion. Grace knelt in the sawdust quietly and leaned her forehead against his. Her bunny dropped onto the floor and rolled away, unnoticed. Helen stepped closer to Emily and whispered, "I think we've found her match." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes wet. Or maybe he found her. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing through the pines and chasing the last of the snow from the rooftop. But inside that training room, something had shifted quietly, irreversibly. For the first time in months, Emily didn't feel like she was standing alone in the dark with her child. Someone else had stepped into the circle, and Grace, who had once told her mother that she didn't believe in seeing anymore, now had something she could feel, something steady, warm, and alive. The first morning Ranger woke in Grace's home, the sun had not yet reached the frost-covered windows. Cedar Glen sat quietly under a gauze of fog, and the Taylor house, an old white farmhouse with green shutters, seemed suspended in its own hush. The smell of coffee floated faintly from the kitchen, where Emily stood barefoot, watching the dog and her daughter from behind the counter. Ranger had taken up his post on the rug beside Grace's bed, his dark eyes alert but relaxed. The moment Grace stirred under her blanket, he stood, not abruptly, but with the kind of quiet reverence that made Emily's chest tighten. Grace slid her legs out of bed, socked feet landing on the hardwood floor with a soft pat. She tilted her head, smiling toward the space she knew he'd be. "Good morning," she whispered. It had been only one day since they brought Ranger home, but already his presence had rewritten the rhythm of their home. He followed Grace not as a shadow, but as a steady pulse, never leading, never lagging, always within arm's reach. When she walked slowly down the hallway, her hand skimmed the wall, and her other hand hovered over Ranger's thick shoulders, trusting him without question. Emily packed Grace's small backpack with snacks and her sensory book, tucking in her bunny, and they stepped out into the morning chill. Ranger's leash was more for show than function. He never pulled. He simply walked beside the girl as though the world depended on her footsteps. At Cedar Glen Park, which bordered the elementary school, Grace walked with confidence she hadn't shown before. The playground had yet to fill with the day's noise, and the early hours belonged mostly to parents with toddlers and retirees walking their dogs. Grace stepped carefully onto the grassy hill, each blade whispering underfoot. She stopped, turned her face upward, and said softly, "I hear the wind touching the fence." Emily looked toward the chain-link fence along the dog run and smiled through sudden tears. Her daughter was listening, really listening again. Grace pointed in another direction. "And a bird, with a funny voice. It's squeaky." Ranger's ears perked, confirming her guess. A chickadee darted overhead, shrilling its song from a crooked pine. For the first time in many months, Grace giggled. They sat on a bench by the walking trail. Emily opened a book and began to read softly, while Grace sat beside Ranger, one hand buried in his thick fur. A few paces away, another mother watched them, her brows furrowed. Her name was Dana Cooper, a tall woman in her early 40s with a sharp, angular face framed by precisely cut blonde hair. She wore a crisp jogging outfit, immaculate white sneakers, and a perpetual tightness around her mouth. Dana had one child, a boy named Tyler, who was 3 and known for his wild energy. Dana was fiercely protective and prone to suspicion, a trait that had only worsened after her son was once bitten by a neighbor's dog. Though the incident had left only a scratch, it scarred Dana's view of all large breeds, especially German shepherds. She eyed Ranger warily. "That dog shouldn't be off-leash," she muttered, even though Ranger was clearly tethered, calm, unmoving. Tyler was running toward the swing set when he suddenly tripped and began crying. Dana rushed over, scooping him up, but her eyes darted toward Ranger again. Seeing Grace place her face close to Ranger's chest, listening to his heartbeat, only seemed to raise her alarm. Emily noticed her expression and offered a polite wave. "He's a service dog," she said gently. "Specially trained for my daughter." Dana's lips parted, then pressed back into a line. "Still, dogs like that are unpredictable." Grace, sensing the tension, leaned closer to Ranger. The dog didn't growl or move. He simply placed one paw gently over Grace's shoe, as if to say, "You're all right. I'm here." Emily sighed and stood. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's walk a little." They headed toward the wooded path behind the playground, where a thin trail snaked around the creek. Grace was more talkative now, though her words were whispers, fragments of sound and rhythm. "The leaves sound like whispers. The creek. It's humming today." Ranger stopped at one point, his body tense. Emily looked up and saw a squirrel frozen on a log. Ranger didn't chase, he merely noted, then looked back to Grace as if to say, "Did you hear that too?" Grace nodded and touched his head. "You saw it. I heard it. That's fair." By the time they returned home, Grace had counted 10 different sounds, hummed to herself, and asked, very shyly, if Ranger could sleep next to her again that night. Emily, startled by the question, had only nodded. In the kitchen that evening, while chopping carrots, she called her sister in Spokane and said, "She's different, not louder, just more alive." Ranger, now without his service vest, padded quietly into Grace's room. He circled once, then lay near her bed. Grace curled beside him on the floor, placing her bunny between them, whispering secrets only dogs and dreams could hear. Spring had settled fully into Cedar Glen, painting the town in soft greens and muddy browns. The last patches of snow had long since melted, and the park bloomed with the sound of life, children laughing, dogs barking, strollers creaking along gravel paths. On that Saturday morning, the Taylor family returned to the park once more, unaware of the moment that would soon divide their quiet life into before and after. Emily carried a thermos of tea, her face warmed by the sun as she watched Grace walk steadily ahead, guided by Ranger's calm pace. Grace wore her favorite soft pink jacket, her hand resting gently on Ranger's back as they moved together like twin notes in a song only they could hear. She was humming something barely audible, perhaps the sound of the wind, perhaps the memory of yesterday's chickadees. Ranger's tail swayed with each step, his alert ears pivoting gently toward every sound, but his body stayed loose and grounded. It was a peaceful morning until it wasn't. They had reached the far side of the park near the enclosed picnic area when Grace knelt down to tie her shoelace. Ranger, as trained, sat beside her. A sudden shriek shattered the calm. Dana Cooper, again present with her son Tyler, screamed as the boy wandered too close to Ranger, tripped on a root, and fell near the dog. Tyler was more startled than hurt, but Dana's voice cracked the air like thunder. "Get that dog away from my child!" she shouted. Emily spun around, startled. "He didn't do anything. He's a service dog." But Dana had already reached for her phone. "He's dangerous. That's a German shepherd. They're aggressive. I'm calling the police. That animal's a threat." Grace froze. Her hands tightened on Ranger's fur. "Mom," she whispered. Emily knelt beside her, voice trembling. "It's all right, sweetheart. Ranger didn't do anything wrong." 10 minutes passed. The air thickened. Families nearby had begun whispering. Ranger stood still, his eyes flicking between Emily and Grace. He didn't bark. He didn't move. Then came the sound of approaching sirens. A sheriff's department cruiser rolled up slowly onto the park path, crunching gravel under its tires. 2 officers stepped out, one older and measured, the other younger and tense. Deputy Caleb Maddox was 27, newly assigned to Cedar Glen. Tall and lean, with close-cropped blonde hair and a nervous edge that clung to his every movement. Caleb had grown up in a city where dogs that looked like Ranger were rarely pets. His training had been thorough, but his instincts were still green, shaped more by fear than experience. The older officer, Sergeant Linda Weaver, followed at a slower pace. She was in her 50s, solidly built, and calm as a lake in winter. Her short gray curls poked from beneath her cap, and her lined face told stories of many calls, many outcomes, some that never faded. "Where's the dog?" Maddox asked, his hand already near his holster. Emily stepped forward. "He's right here. His name is Ranger. He's a service animal. He hasn't harmed anyone." Dana, standing to the side, arms crossed, cut in. "That thing is dangerous. It lunged at my child." "That's not true," Grace cried out, louder than anyone had ever heard her. "He didn't move." Maddox looked at the child, tiny, trembling, clutching the dog like he was air itself. But his attention snapped back when Ranger, sensing the tension, stepped slightly in front of Grace in a protective stance. And in that split second, Maddox made a mistake. Without a warning shout, he reached for his taser and fired. The dart struck Ranger's side, and the dog let out a guttural yelp, a sound so unnatural and filled with pain, it seemed to rip through the earth itself. "No!" Grace screamed, throwing herself forward. The force of the taser knocked Ranger sideways. As Grace lunged, she tripped and hit her cheek hard against the ground. Emily rushed to her, heart hammering in her chest, shouting incoherent words between sobs. Sergeant Weaver stepped between them all, her voice sharp. "Stand down, Maddox. What the hell are you doing?" Maddox, already pale, dropped the taser. "He moved at me. He looked like he was going to—" "He's a service dog with a child," Weaver said through clenched teeth. "Use your head." Paramedics arrived within minutes. Ranger was still conscious, but whimpering in pain, muscles twitching from the shock. Grace wouldn't let go of him, even as a medic gently checked the swelling on her cheek. Her voice was cracked and wet with tears. "He didn't do anything. He was helping me. He was helping—" Weaver turned to Maddox, her jaw locked. "You just tased a certified service animal in front of a crowd, and a blind child. I thought—" "You didn't think," she snapped. "You panicked." That night, the incident lit up social media. Parents posted videos. One clip showed Grace sobbing, shielding Ranger with her body. Another captured Emily screaming at the officers. Hashtags began to spread. Number Justice for Ranger and Number Grace deserves better. Maddox stayed quiet through the night, sitting in his cruiser long after his shift ended. His hands shook. He wasn't a bad man, but he had made a bad call, and the image of the child's scream, the dog's cry, kept playing over and over in his mind. He pulled out his phone and looked up service dog protocols. Then he read Grace's file, which Weaver had placed on his desk. And that's when the weight hit him, not as an officer, but as a person. A child without sight had trusted that dog more than the world itself, and he had torn through it like it was paper. It would take more than regret to make this right. And for the first time in his young career, Caleb Maddox felt the sting of real shame, not from policy or punishment, but from the realization that he had hurt someone who had already lost too much. The snow came earlier than expected. By dusk, Cedar Glen was wrapped in thick silence, the kind that blankets all movement and dulls every sound. Wind battered the windows of the Taylor farmhouse, howling like a chorus of ancient ghosts. The temperature dropped quickly, biting through the wood and walls. Emily had kept Grace home from school after the incident, and Ranger hadn't moved much since. He lay curled on the rug, not in his usual alert posture, but flat, limp, breathing shallowly. Emily noticed it first, the erratic rhythm beneath his ribs when she placed a gentle hand on his side. At first, she thought it was her own nerves still buzzing from the trauma at the park, but then it skipped again and again. The strong, even heartbeat that had once soothed Grace now fluttered like a broken metronome. Her heart thudded with dread. Ranger's coat looked slightly duller, and his ears no longer lifted at the sounds around him. Grace knelt beside him, whispering into his fur, her small hands running over his head. "Don't go," she murmured. "Don't go yet. I just found you." Emily grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in months. The voice on the other end was brisk but warm. "Ellie Morgan speaking." "Ellie, it's me, Emily Taylor." A pause. "Em, are you all right?" "Number?" "It's Ranger. He's showing signs of cardiac arrhythmia, probably triggered by the taser." Her voice cracked. He needs the beta blocker compound you used in Denver on your retired K9 cases. Do you still have access to it? Another pause. Yes, but it's not stocked here. It's strictly at the regional lab, and we're locked down with this blizzard. The roads are getting closed one by one. Emily looked outside. Snow was coming down hard now, sideways, pushed by wind that bent the trees. Then I'll come to you. No, you won't, Ellie said sharply. You'll kill yourself on those roads. Let me try something. Give me half an hour. Emily set the phone down and looked at her daughter, who had not left the ranger's side. Grace's pale face was drawn, her eyes red. He's cold, Mommy. I know, baby, she said softly. We're going to help him. Outside, the storm showed no signs of easing. Lights flickered once. Emily gathered extra blankets and lit the old gas heater near the den. She wrapped Ranger's body in warmth and sat beside him, stroking his head with trembling fingers. Across the state line in Denver, Ellie Morgan moved fast. She was a compact woman in her late 40s, with dark, tightly curled hair and a sharp, analytical face that rarely betrayed emotion. But her heart had always been too big for a lab coat alone. She worked as the director of a trauma recovery canine program and had overseen hundreds of high-risk cases, including Ranger's early transition out of service. She still remembered his eyes, serious, somber, but oddly tender. A dog that had seen too much and yet chosen kindness again. She made a call to a volunteer pilot she knew, a veteran named Reed Holloway. Reed, in his 50s, flew small missions for animal rescue and emergency transport. Gruff but reliable, with a salt and pepper beard and deep laugh lines around his eyes, Reed had once landed a Cessna in a flooded field to deliver vaccines to a rural shelter. He didn't ask questions when Ellie told him the weather was hostile. I'll try to get halfway to you, he said. Meet me in Ridgetop. But tell your friend she's got a 4-wheel drive and chains, or she's not making it up the canyon. Back in Cedar Glen, Emily got the call. She glanced toward the road. Snow had blanketed everything. The highway to Ridgetop was barely visible on the traffic map. Grace, she said softly, we're going to get medicine for Ranger. You'll stay here with Miss Luann, okay? Grace's face tightened. Number. I want to come. It's too dangerous, honey. I don't care. The doorbell rang. Luann McBride, their elderly neighbor, stood bundled in 4 layers, holding a thermos and a flashlight. She was a widow in her 70s, with a kind face carved by weather and wisdom. You go, Em. I'll stay with Grace. Don't you argue. Emily nodded, kissed Grace's forehead, and ran out the door, her parka already dusted in white. Her truck roared to life after a tense few seconds. She had installed chains the week prior, but had never used them in a storm like this. She drove slowly, wheels slipping at every turn, eyes straining to follow the faint path ahead. The road to Ridgetop was narrow and winding, slicing through forested ridges and sudden drop-offs. The blizzard pounded her windshield. More than once she considered turning back, but each time she saw Ranger's still form, Grace's silent face, and she pressed on. Meanwhile, Ellie met Reed at the snowy field they called Ridgetop Airstrip. A mere stretch of cleared gravel. The man stood outside his plane, goggles on, heavy coat whipping in the wind. You sure she's coming? He shouted over the gale. She's already halfway here, Ellie replied. An hour later, Emily's headlights broke through the trees. Her truck skidded into the clearing, narrowly missing a fence post. She stumbled out, face raw from cold. Ellie didn't speak. She simply handed her the vial. For intravenous only, she said. Small dose, twice daily. Thank you, Emily whispered. She hugged Ellie tightly before turning and driving back into the storm. The return felt longer, heavier, like carrying the whole world in a bottle no bigger than her thumb. Back home, Grace was awake. Luann had read her a story, but the girl hadn't listened. The moment Emily returned, Grace rushed to Ranger, who still lay curled in the den. Emily prepared the injection with steady fingers, inserted the IV line as gently as she could. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, Ranger's breathing slowed, steadied. His paws twitched. A low, tired sound emerged from his throat. A soft thrum, almost like a sigh. Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He's staying, she whispered. He's staying. The snow outside had begun to melt, leaving Cedar Glen in a glistening slush of grays and whites. The worst of the storm had passed, but the chill remained, lingering like a memory that refused to fade. Inside the farmhouse, warmth returned, not just from the flickering fireplace or the electric heater finally working again, but from the quiet rhythm of recovery. Ranger was breathing evenly now, curled beside Grace on the rug as she leaned against him, a crayon in her tiny hand drawing circles she couldn't see, but somehow still felt. Emily watched them from the kitchen table, a cup of tea untouched before her, the laptop open to a pause screen. She'd been staring at the call log for nearly 10 minutes. The emergency services record from the day of the park incident had finally arrived, thanks to a favor she'd called in with a friend from veterinary school who now worked in local government records. The call that prompted the police response had come from a blocked number. No name. Just one sentence logged: "There's a dangerous dog threatening a blind child at the Northwood Park Trail." And then the call had ended. Emily's jaw tightened. She remembered how the officers had been so quick to react, how the younger one, Deputy Maddox, had hesitated just a second too late before firing. But who had made that call, and why? She clicked through the logs again, then opened the audio file linked to the report. A raspy male voice, purposefully deepened. "There's a German shepherd harassing a blind girl on the trail. It looks aggressive. Please send someone fast." That was it. But something about the voice itched at her memory. She had heard that cadence before, somewhere nearby. Someone who knew Ranger's breed. Someone who knew about Grace's blindness. Emily stood abruptly, walked over to the bookshelf, and pulled down a dusty old photo album. Between the pages were clippings and notes from her early days working at the Cedar Glen Canine Rehabilitation Center back when Ranger had just arrived, still raw from his military retirement. One of the volunteers, Gerald Tate, had always disliked Ranger. Emily recalled his complaints calling the dog overtrained and unstable. Tate had left the center a year ago after a heated argument about a dog placement. She searched for his name in her town contact list and found it. Gerald Tate, 59, currently living on the outskirts of town. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the timing, the voice, and the bitterness all aligned too closely. Just as she was jotting down notes, a knock sounded at the door. Grace looked up, her head tilting slightly. Ranger stirred beside her, ears twitching. Emily opened the door to find Mr. Whitman standing there, hat in hand, boots still dusted with snow. He was in his late 70s, tall and lean, with a frame that had once been strong but was now shaped by age. His lined face often bore a gruff expression, and he had a reputation for being reclusive and sharp-tongued. Most neighbors avoided him, but today his eyes were softer. "I heard about what happened," he said simply, voice rough as gravel. "I saw it." Emily blinked. "You were at the park?" "I was on the bench up near the north slope," he said, glancing past her toward Ranger. "I saw the officers, saw them draw, saw the girl fall, and I saw that dog never move toward her, only tried to shield her." Her heart skipped. "You could testify?" "If need be," he nodded. "More than that, I saw a man leave the trail right before the police came. Tall, dark coat, limp in the right leg. Looked familiar, but I couldn't place him until this morning." Emily's breath caught. "Gerald Tate." Whitman gave a small grunt. "That's him. He's renting up on Timber Road, just north of the old cannery." Grace had wandered to the doorway, her small frame wrapped in a fuzzy blue sweater. She reached out toward Whitman, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity. Ranger followed her with a low chuff, then sat beside her protectively. Mr. Whitman knelt slowly, his knees creaking. "Hello there," he said gently. "You must be Grace." She nodded. He looked at Ranger. "You did good, boy." To Emily's surprise, Ranger pressed his snout gently into the man's hand. "Would you like to come in?" Emily asked, her voice warmer than she expected. Whitman hesitated, then stepped inside. "I brought something," he said, lifting a wrapped box from his coat. "For the girl. It's just some old wooden puzzles. My wife made them years ago. Thought she might like them." Grace opened the package carefully, her fingers moving across the carved-shaped stars, animals, a heart. She smiled faintly, then placed one on the floor for Ranger to sniff. That evening, Whitman stayed for tea. They talked quietly while Grace played on the floor. He shared stories about his late wife, Marjorie, who had been a school teacher and loved children deeply. Since her passing, he had grown more withdrawn, but something about Grace and Ranger stirred something dormant in him. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long golden shadows across the fields outside, Emily felt a new thread forming in their lives, quiet, tentative, but real. Not just answers, not just a step toward justice, but, perhaps slowly, the forming of something like family. The wind outside howled like an old lullaby torn apart by distance. It swept across the flatlands of Cedar Glen, rattling the porch swing and tugging at the last crusts of melting snow along the gravel path. Inside the farmhouse, a hush had fallen over the living room, broken only by the gentle ticking of the clock and the faint, wheezing breaths of Ranger. The German shepherd lay curled on the thick rug by the fireplace, his once vibrant eyes dull but alert. Each breath came harder than the last. His thick coat, once a proud armor of black and gold, was now faintly matted at the chest where Grace had gently rested her head earlier that morning. Emily sat nearby, phone clutched tightly, knuckles white. She had just finished coordinating the airlift with Denver's Animal Emergency Hospital, and time was against them. Across from her, Grace, no more than 6 years old, her face still as pale as the morning frost, sat quietly with one hand resting on Ranger's paw. Her soft brown hair was braided loosely down her back, slightly undone from hours of pacing and silent worry. She looked smaller than ever in her oversized gray hoodie, sleeves bunched around her fists, and her gray eyes unfocused but turned always toward the direction of Ranger's breathing. Suddenly, a soft melody filled the room. At first, it was barely a whisper shy, uneven, but slowly, as if pulled by some invisible thread of courage, Grace began to sing. It wasn't a song anyone taught her, just something she remembered her mother humming long ago when the nights were bad and her father was still alive. The tune rose and fell like the wind itself, fragile, aching, and tender. The words didn't matter. It was the sound, a girl's voice carried by hope, binding her to the soul of the animal beside her. Ranger's ears twitched, his breathing hitched, then evened. Emily watched in stunned silence, tears brimming. It had been months since Grace had spoken to anyone longer, still since she had dared to sing. This wasn't a song for an audience. This was a song for survival, a song to hold someone close when the world threatened to take them away. Just then, the rumble of rotors echoed in the distance. "Helicopter's coming!" a voice called from outside. Emily rushed to the door and opened it. A light snow had begun to fall again, fine powder dancing in the air like feathers. At the far end of the clearing, red and blue lights flashed behind the silhouette of a dark SUV. Deputy Maddox stepped out, tall and stiff in his uniform jacket. He looked tired, the lines around his mouth deeper than before. His short, neat hair was tousled from the wind, and he clutched a walkie-talkie with both hands as if it tethered him to purpose. He was the one who had organized the escort to the landing site. After what happened in the park, Maddox had kept his distance, but something had shifted in him. He had shown up that morning without being asked. No excuses, just a quiet, "I'll help." Emily met his eyes briefly. He nodded once, almost apologetically, then turned to direct the landing. The helicopter descended with a roar that shook the windows. Its white body bore the red cross of the Denver Veterinary Emergency Flight Unit. 2 medics jumped out. One of them, a tall black woman in her 30s named Nurse Rowan, moved with efficient gentleness. She had short, tightly curled hair and warm brown eyes that scanned the room with clinical focus, but softened the moment they landed on Grace. Rowan knelt beside Ranger and quickly assessed him, murmuring words Emily couldn't catch. The other medic, a sandy-haired man named Cole, set up the transport stretcher and prepared the IV line. His pulse is faint, but steady. "We'll stabilize him en route," Rowan said calmly. "We've seen worse. He's got fight in him." Grace hadn't moved. She clutched Ranger's paw tightly, lips still trembling with the memory of her song. Emily crouched beside her daughter. "Sweetheart, they need to take Ranger now." Grace shook her head. "I want to go." Rowan hesitated. "We don't usually take passengers unless—" "She's his partner," Emily said softly. "He doesn't trust easily. He'll need her." Maddox stepped forward. "I've cleared it with Denver. Grace rides with them." Emily blinked, surprised. Rowan looked between them, then nodded. "Okay, let's get him on board." They secured Ranger carefully into the stretcher, his IV in place. oxygen gently feeding into his nose. Grace followed close, her tiny frame bundled into a thick red coat that dwarfed her. Emily helped her up the ramp, kissing her forehead and whispering, "Sing to him if he gets scared." The cabin of the helicopter roared to life. As the blades spun faster, Grace leaned close to Ranger's ear and began to hum again, barely audible over the mechanical thunder. But Ranger's body relaxed just slightly. Enough. Outside, Maddox stood still, arms folded tightly. Emily approached him, her voice low. "You didn't have to come." He looked at her, guilt still weighing his shoulders. "Yes, I did." She studied him a moment, then offered a nod. Not forgiveness, not yet. But maybe the beginning of it. The helicopter lifted slowly, vanishing into the soft snow sky. Below, on the frozen ground, a community held its breath. The air inside the medical wing of Andrews Veterinary Emergency Base was sterile and still, humming faintly with the sound of machines, fluorescent lights, and tension. Snow still streaked the windows outside, but in here, time had narrowed into the space of a heartbeat, the one they all waited to return. Ranger lay on the stainless steel examination table, an oxygen mask covering his snout, sensors attached to his chest, and a team of specialists clustered around him. His chest no longer rose. His heartbeat had stopped exactly 17 seconds ago. Dr. Nadia Lee, the attending cardiologist, stood motionless for a breath, dark eyes sharp behind her glasses, short black hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She was known for precision and calm under pressure. "No response to last epi," she said, voice clipped but steady. "One more shock, charging." Just outside the room, Grace stood with Nurse Rowan, clutching a worn fleece blanket in both arms. Her cheeks were pale and damp. Her body trembled in the oversized red coat she hadn't removed since leaving home. Emily knelt beside her, rubbing small circles on her back. "Can I go in?" Grace whispered. Emily looked to Rowan. The nurse hesitated, then nodded toward the doorway. "They'll only allow a second." Dr. Lee turned as the doors opened. "We're losing him. 30 seconds or—" But then she saw Grace, so small against the tall doorway, so still. The room stilled. Grace took a slow step forward. Her shoes squeaked on the polished floor. She didn't say a word until she reached Ranger's side. Her fingers moved gently over his fur, still warm but too quiet. "Don't leave me in the dark," she said. The words were soft, not dramatic, not shouted. Just a child, asking a friend to stay. A second passed, then 2. Then the monitor beeped once, faintly, then again. The line twitched, a flutter. Dr. Lee's brows shot up. "We have pulse." Nurse Cole moved instantly to stabilize the IV. Rowan stepped in with oxygen support. The room erupted into motion again, but at the center of it all, Grace remained unmoving, still cradling Ranger's head, her tears now silent. Emily gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. She sank into a nearby chair, knees buckling from the release of fear. Dr. Lee murmured something into her comms, half shaking her head in disbelief. Then the doors opened again. A tall man in a long wool coat entered, snow melting off his shoulders. He looked to be in his early 70s, his silver-gray hair swept neatly back, skin weathered but strikingly calm. He had the kind of bearing that spoke of a lifetime in high positions, someone who had been obeyed for most of his life, but now moved with quiet gravity rather than command. In his left hand, he held a small vial in a temperature-controlled case. "I've got the compound," he said simply. Dr. Lee stepped toward him. "Dr. Bennett?" "Yes, I synthesized it myself. 40 milligrams, stabilized, should hold until morning." Cole took the vial from him and moved immediately toward the prep station. Emily stood, eyes narrowing. "Wait, Bennett?" He looked at her fully now. "I'm Henry Bennett," he said, voice softer than expected. I'm was Michael's father." Emily blinked as if struck. Michael, her late husband. For years they had been estranged from Henry after an old falling out one Emily had never fully understood, but which ran deep. The military and science had always come first to Henry, often at the cost of family. When Michael died in a roadside accident 3 years ago, Henry hadn't come to the funeral, or sent flowers, or called. Grace turned slightly, sensing the name. "You're my grandpa?" she asked, voice feather-light. Henry stepped closer, then knelt awkwardly, stiffly, until he was on the floor beside her. "Yes," he said, eyes misting. If you'll let me be." Emily didn't move. Grace did. She leaned slightly toward him, just enough to rest her forehead on his shoulder. No words. No questions. Just a tired child with a hurting heart. Henry's breath hitched audibly. In the background, the machines continued their work. Ranger's pulse had stabilized. His body was still weak, but he was out of arrest. Dr. Lee gently stepped forward. "We'll need to keep him under for at least 24 hours. But your dog, he's fighting." Emily watched the scene unfold, her daughter at the edge of devastation and miracle, her late husband's father kneeling in humility and regret, and the dog that held all their hopes breathing once again. "Thank you," she whispered to no one and everyone. Later that night, Grace refused to leave Ranger's side, so a cot was rolled into the observation room. Emily sat beside her while Henry made tea in the waiting lounge, unsteady but trying. They didn't talk much, but that was okay. Some things didn't need words yet. Outside, the storm had passed. The skies above Cedar Glen cleared slowly, revealing a field of stars. And inside, a heartbeat continued, fragile, steady, and true. 1 year had passed since the snowstorm, the silence, and the heartbeat that returned in the dark. Now, the morning sun of Helena, Montana rose over the steps of the state capitol, turning its white dome gold and brightening the sky to a crisp blue. The city had shaken off winter and settled into a gentle spring, with cherry blossoms spilling from every corner and flags fluttering gently above rows of folding chairs placed for the ceremony. Grace, now almost 7, stood quietly at the bottom of the grand stone steps, her white cane folded at her side, and Ranger sitting faithfully by her left leg. The German shepherd looked stronger than he had the night in the snow. A year older, yes, but his coat had regained its sheen, and his gaze was clear and loyal. He wore his new harness proudly, marked with a silver tag: Ranger, Service Dog, Veteran, Survivor. Grace wore a sky-blue dress with tiny embroidered stars along the hem, and her long hair had been carefully braided by Emily that morning. Her posture was more upright now, more assured, though she still tilted her head slightly when she listened, like she was tuning herself to the frequency of the world. She was growing, healing. "Are you ready, Grace?" Emily asked gently, kneeling beside her. Grace nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Emily stood, placing a hand briefly on her daughter's shoulder. Emily herself looked more at ease than she had in years. The grief she once wore like a veil had lifted, replaced by something quieter and warmer. Her hair was pinned back into a low bun, and she wore a deep navy blazer with a small pin of a paw and heart on the lapel. Behind them stood their extended family, just as the press had started calling them. Dr. Henry Bennett stood tall in a tailored gray coat, his once distant expression softened with pride. He had become a regular visitor at their home in Cedar Glen, and had even started a non-profit foundation for veterinary medicine scholarships. Next to him, Mr. Whitman wore a pressed beige suit that still looked slightly too large on his stooped shoulders, but he beamed with pride, holding a hand-painted sign that said, "Go Grace," in big, bold letters. The grumpy neighbor had long since evolved into a grumbling grandfather figure, gruff but protective. And a few steps back, Deputy Maddox stood in uniform, not as a patrolling officer, but now officially part of the newly launched Montana Service K-9 initiative. His expression was solemn, but when Ranger caught sight of him, the dog's ears perked slightly and his tail gave a quiet thump. Maddox smiled at that and gave the slightest nod. The crowd began to hush as Representative Linda Garvey stepped up to the podium. She was a tall black woman in her 40s, with a commanding presence and a warm, deliberate voice. Once a public defender, Garvey had sponsored the bill that now bore Ranger's name. She adjusted the microphone and addressed the gathering crowd and press. 1 year ago, she began, a little girl, her dog, and her courage changed the course of our state's law. Murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. Today, we celebrate not only the passing of Ranger's law legislation that guarantees stricter protections for all service animals across Montana, but also the extraordinary resilience of those who inspired it. She turned slightly and gestured to Grace. Grace Whitmore has asked to say a few words. The air held still as Emily guided her daughter gently up the steps. Ranger trotted beside them, in perfect sync. At the podium, Grace reached out and found the mic with her fingers. She took a breath. The crowd, 100 strong, leaned in. "My name is Grace," she said simply, "and this is my best friend, Ranger. He sees for me. He helps me know the world, even though I can't see it like you do." There was a hush. But Ranger didn't just help me walk. He helped me be brave again. And when someone hurt him, I wanted to make sure no one else would ever lose a friend like that. Emily wiped her eyes. Maddox looked down at his boots. "So, I hope this law means other dogs will be safe, and other kids will feel strong, even if they're small, even if they're scared." The crowd rose in quiet applause. Not loud or roaring, but respectful, emotional, powerful. Grace stepped down slowly, and Ranger guided her back toward Emily, his tail wagging gently, a low woof escaping his throat like a quiet cheer. Reporters snapped photos. Children in the crowd waved signs. One boy in a wheelchair reached toward them, and Grace turned at the sound of his bracelet jingling. She smiled and waved. After the ceremony, in the Capitol garden, families mingled. Dogs in training moved among the guests, guided by their handlers. A tall woman named Leah Maddox's cousin and a veteran handler spoke to Emily about opening a Cedar Glen satellite center. Bennett stood near a sculpture unveiling, a small bronze statue of a German shepherd, ears alert, seated with pride. Grace knelt beside it, resting her hand on the bronze paw. "Feels like him," she whispered. Whitman offered her a peppermint and joked about sneaking Ranger a donut, only to be gently scolded by Emily. Maddox sat on the low wall nearby, helping a new recruit leash train his first service dog, a bright-eyed lab named Juno. The sun dipped lower behind the mountains, painting the sky with lavender and gold. As shadows grew longer, Grace leaned against Ranger's side. "Do you think they'll always remember us?" she asked softly. Emily knelt beside her, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Maybe," she said, "but more importantly, they'll remember what you did." Grace didn't say anything for a moment. Then she turned her face up toward the sky, where light and wind passed freely. "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore," she said. Ranger, ever by her side, gave a quiet chuff, and the two of them sat there in silence. Girl and dog, story and law, heart and light. Sometimes, the smallest hands carry the greatest faith, and through a child's whisper and a loyal dog's heartbeat, we are reminded that miracles still happen. In a world that can feel so loud, perhaps it is in silence that God speaks loudest. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe to our channel for more true stories like this, and may the Lord bless everyone watching. Type Amen if you believe in quiet miracles too.